Hello and welcome to Stitches and Stories at the Baker Estate Library and Archives. I am the author, and this evening I have the privilege to share Mycelium Hearts with you. This is a guest-submitted story that has become near and dear to our staff at the estate. Very little history was provided other than that this is believed to be a real account. Research is still pending. Before we begin, I want to take the opportunity to answer some questions from our previous story. What is the benefactor? Oh! Do you mean who? They are... And now, please settle in for Mycelium Hearts. This memoir is to not only preserve your memory, but to stand testament to the loss the world must experience without you. This is for you, with all our heart, my dear Tramella. My lab was never a place that I considered unsafe. After all, I had been there for years, researching and creating various unique concoctions. It wasn't until I very nearly walked into an intruder who was casually browsing my shelves that I even put thought to any kind of security. I slunk back into the shadows of the cave, away from the ever-glowing wall moss. She, didn't appear to notice me and continued to read the labels on the various jars and files. The familiar unease at seeing a human began to crawl up my body. I observed silently, hoping she would grow bored and leave. As though she heard me, she suddenly turned to where I was and called out, "Hello? Someone there?" I didn't respond. I was far enough in the shadows that she shouldn't be able to see me. "Hello?" She raised an arm. Her hand began to glow brightly, illuminating the craggy walls that made up my laboratory. Panic seized me. I stepped forward with my arms crossed in front of me. "Please turn that off. The specimens cannot be exposed to sunlight." She jumped back a little and dimmed the light to nothing. "Oh, sorry there. No worries though, that's my own spell. It doesn't affect light-sensitive things. I use it in my own lab." She smiles at me. Her face is slightly pointed and surrounded by a mass of orange curls. I looked between her and the pieces of fungi on the rock shelf behind me. There appeared to be no damage done by the light, but I now had to resolve my intruder problem. I turned back to face her, standing to my full height, hoping to appear somewhat intimidating. "There is no damage. Did you intend to take anything?" Her smile grew and she put a hand out. "Not unless you plan to trade. Name's Meredith, by the way. Heard about you from that scale folk down the way. Druck, I think." Partly relieved, but still uncertain, I stared at her hand for a moment before reaching out with my own appendage. "Ular." There was a moment of silence where she merely stared at me. I pulled my arm back, releasing her hand. "Did he send you here?" I asked. She startled a bit from her observing. Not exactly. See, I'm a potion maker, and I'm going around looking for new ingredients and recipes, and I'm staying nearby, and I heard about you and your remedies, and I wanted to speak with you, and I may have just, walked in." Meredith seemed to shrink back a bit. It was true that I traded down in the village for supplies that I couldn't gather myself, but this was the first time I had been sought out by someone. My silence seemed to unnerve her. She began to fidget with the sleeves of her robe and adjust the straps of her leather satchel. I decided to offer her trade, that this would finish our interaction. "If you are looking to trade, I would be amenable." She brightened. "That's lovely. What are you offering?" Several days passed, and I was due for a walk to the village. Donning a cloak, I made my way to Drock's shop. The scaled folk had been very kind to me in my past, despite the reputation of my people, and we had long ago started our monthly routine. He had thanked me for the potions and sent me on my way with fresh journals and more coal. Returning to my cave, I spotted a familiar glow. Meredith was standing outside the entrance with her hand softly alight. It was odd, but I wasn't perturbed by the sight of her. She proved to be quite knowledgeable during our previous encounter. She looked up once the creak of my wagon alerted her, and she smiled. In the light, I noticed the specks that dotted her brown skin. Good evening. I paused to nod my head in greeting. Would you like to trade again? Her smile grew. And so began the visits. At the beginning, it was only weekly that Meredith would stop by, mostly wanting to trade, but also to discuss potion making and exchange techniques. During these visits, I began to notice more things about her. Her robes held many pockets for ingredients. Her laughter reminded me of birdsong, and she nearly always had a tin of what she referred to as sweet treats. I grew fond of these moments, of seeing her smile and hearing of her latest travel. When the days began to shorten, Meredith mentioned that she may stay in the village over winter rather than move north as she had planned. This prospect filled me with a secret delight that I had not expected. By the time the snow began to fall, Meredith was spending nearly every day with me, shivering in the cold cave that made my home. Much to Drock's confusion, I requested that he gather extra coal, firewood, and something sweet the next time I headed into the village. I merely explained that I now had a regular guest. These items were not meant to be a grand gesture, but regardless of my intention, Meredith took the change in with a gentle delight that I had not seen before. Will a dry heap bother you? The question startled me. I hadn't even thought about what this would do to my physicality. Warmth does not disturb me, but I will refrain from getting too close to it. She smiled and began to build a fire. Sitting together on our makeshift log seat, I rose to my feet. One moment. I procured something for you. She raised her eyebrows at me, but gestured for me to go on. Retrieving the small satchel Drock had gathered for me, I sat back down and presented it to her. Are these sugar crystals? She questioned, pulling out a piece of hazy crystalline-like sugar. I hope these are to your standards. I was unsure of what is appropriate for you to eat, but Drock assured me that these are quite popular. I waited for her response, but any dysregulation I felt when I had presented her with the gift was banished when she presented me with the biggest smile she was capable of. What did I do to deserve such a sweet gesture? She asked before popping one into her mouth. There is no exchange necessary. I simply thought of you while placing my supply order. Meredith laughed sweetly and placed her hand on my arm. That is what we refer to as a rhetorical question, darling. After she left for the evening, the sensation of her touching my arm remained. My world was generally orderly and quiet, but ever since the appearance of Meredith, there was a feeling growing that I had no way to define. It seemed to only happen when she was near me, or when I thought of her, as though I had become a spore again and was floating on a warm breeze. Unsure, but seeking guidance, I deliberated that I would consult Meredith on the issue. During a quiet evening, a few days later, I brought up my dilemma. I have a question about human magics. Meredith paused in her note copying to look at me. I don't know much, but I can hazard a guess. What's on your mind? This surprised me. Meredith appeared more than capable with magic, but this was something outside of my frame of reference. Are there greater magics than what you can do? I believed you to be an expert in your practice. I carefully prompted. I wanted to avoid possibly offending her. She looked at me in confusion for a moment before her eyes widened, and she laughed brightly. Put off by this reaction, I merely waited for her response. Once she had gathered her composure, she set her work supplies down and slid closer to me on the log. She gently took my hand in hers. I'm not human. Well, I'm half one. My mother is fair folk. She raised me. With her other hand, she pulled back some of the orange curls to reveal a pointed ear. A quiet, "Oh," was all I could muster. I know Sporlins are pretty removed from other folk, but I'm surprised this is the first time this has come up. Did your group not meet other people? Her question was filled with kindness, but I lowered my head. My circle was wiped out by human bandits hoping to hide in this very cave. The silence sat between us for a moment, but Meredith applied light pressure to my hand before sitting even closer. You must have been so scared. Is that why you seemed frightened when we first met? She asked with genuine concern. It was also the fact that a stranger wandered into my home unannounced, attempting levity to avoid the topic. She huffed a laugh. And here we are now. I was very aware of her thumb running over my joints. I will always miss them, but I now understand that not all humans are like those ones. This logic, however, doesn't comfort me when meeting a human, or what I believed to be one. Before I allowed the memories to take over, I sat up straighter and pressed on. I am merely asking about your magics, as I believe I may have been caught in an unintended side effect of a spell. Meredith frowned slightly. And why do you believe that? There was a small hesitation, as though I suddenly didn't want to explain. Ular? I broke. I have been able to log these effects for the last 3 weeks. They began as a simple feeling when I was physically near you, as though I had begun to float, but only slightly. This then began to happen when you crossed my thoughts. I've also begun to experience what I can only describe as an exhilaration when we make physical contact. This is recent, as we have exchanged contact before, and this sensation was not present. These changes do appear to be growing steadily, and I'm uncertain of the cause, but I felt the need to consult you on the matter. Meredith's face made several changes. May I test the theory? I nodded, wanting to understand what was happening to me. What do you feel when I do this? She raised both hands and cupped my face. The exhilaration has returned, as though it is running up and down my body. She tilted her head and moved closer. And this? She leaned in and pressed her lips to my face where a mouth might be on any other creature. Every single filament of hyphae in my body seemed to explode. She leaned back and gazed at me softly, still holding my face. This isn't a magic, darling. This is a deep affection. Believe me, I feel it too. Moving on pure instinct, I reached out to place my hand on her face as well. Leaning in, I placed my forehead against hers and closed my eyes. Meredith let out a sweet sigh, and I felt a deep sense of peace fall over me. This peace lasted until spring was nearing its end. I learned what it meant to care for someone so deeply that there was a near physical ache. Meredith had continued to refer to me as darlin', which she explained was a term of endearment. Not to leave this notion unfulfilled on my side, I began to refer to her as my tremella. When questioned, I gave a flustered explanation that I had found the tremella fungi to be exceptionally beautiful. This earned me a multitude of what Meredith referred to as kisses. I learned that some embarrassment was worth the affection. During our many discussions, Meredith brought up wanting to begin her travels again. While I knew this was a distinct possibility, it brought a painful ache to my being to think about her leaving. I will remain here for your possible return when you decide to set out. Meredith looked confused. Why wouldn't you be coming with me? I cannot travel in direct sunlight. This would impede your progress. And many are wary of sporlins. I do not wish to interrupt your goals. She considered this for a moment. If I can find a way to make travel easy, would you come with me? With no hesitation, I pressed my forehead to hers. I would be honored to remain with you. While we stood there holding each other, I could not understand how much I would begin to regret agreeing. Meredith was many things. Intelligent, beautiful, talented, but her strongest trait seemed to be determination. It's what motivated her to continue to visit me and drove her to learn about the natural world while improving her potions. This trait was also our downfall. While I floated in a haze of bliss, I ignored the signs of her growing obsession. She began to make small day trips for ingredients and research. These were relatively normal excursions that raised no alarm. By the middle of autumn, Meredith had begun to solely focus on finding a way to allow me free travel. It was when she began to neglect her normal potions work that I questioned her. Darling, there's nothing to worry about. I have a feeling that I'm close to the answer. Then we can travel the world together. Her sweet words and gentle touch soothed me, but it didn't completely dispel my concern. Her excursions began to take longer. There were whole weeks where she had not returned, but I continued to trust her. She had held a visiting schedule like this before, though not so close to winter. As she prepared for another trip, I confronted her with my worry. Please do not continue to exert yourself this way. I'm beginning to worry for your health and safety. Please, my Tremella. She smiled sweetly at me and held my hands while she reassured me that this would be the final trip she needed. The glint of obsession did not leave her eyes, but I was unable to convince her to stay. She was gone for nearly a month. In my concern, I began to visit the village more often, asking for any news of her, but to my dismay there was nothing. When despair had begun to settle in, she finally arrived in a whirl of jubilation and snow. She looked thin and frail, as though this expedition had taken a piece of her. This did not appear to dampen her spirits as she flung herself at me with a joyful cry. I felt many conflicting emotions, but my affection swelled at the sight of her, nearly at peace now that she was back in my arms. Darling, I did it. I have what we need. Come here, sit. She pulled me to our log and quickly began a fire. I was shocked. While I had every confidence in her, it was still a surprise to learn that she had managed to come up with a solution to my nature. What have you learned? She pulled a vial out of her satchel and displayed it proudly. It was a simple vial, but it contained a swirling blue liquid. It took so much research, but with this we can change your response to sunlight. You might still be a little sensitive, but we can work with that. She beamed at me proudly. Overwhelmed with concern, affection, and trepidation, I wasn't sure how to respond. Ever astute, she smiled and reached for my hands. Ular, do you trust me? Yes. Do you trust my potion making? Of course. I still ask you for your consultation. She leaned closer and tilted her head. Do you love me? I pressed our heads together, unquestioningly. We agreed to one more peaceful night. Meredith allowed me to review her research, and we settled on waiting until a bright sunny day for optimal results. Standing side by side at the mouth of a cave, she retrieved the vial and held it up. I will drink half, and you'll need to pour it over yourself while we are touching. We must be connected. I nodded and grasped her hand with nervous energy. She raised the vial to her lips. Meredith? She paused. I love you. She smiled and took a swig before drizzling the remainder on me. The reaction was instantaneous. I remember her smiling face, then nothing but darkness. When consciousness flooded my being, I was looking at the ceiling of the cave mouth. I felt strange, disconnected from my body, but at the same time anchored to something else. In a haze, I pushed myself up, trying to stand but falling forward onto my hands. My vision was disjointed, but as I stared at the appendages holding me up, an aching pit began to form in my center. My arms no longer consisted of a brownish-purple mycelium, but a delicate brown skin. Mara, I tried to call out, but I stopped. It sounded wrong. Not her, not me, but something else. Frantically rising to my now small stature, I looked around, but I was alone. My head felt heavy, and there was a growing pain in my chest. Meredith. I moved into the cave. She was not there. I made my way back toward the entrance, calling her name. Silence responded. I only paused when I heard a crunch underneath her boot, where the vial lay broken. Staring at the vial, I tried to think, but my mind was cluttered with flashes of images. Me looking at Meredith, her looking at me, the vial in her hand, on her lips, pouring it over me, us collapsing, my body disintegrating, Meredith screaming while spores landed on her outstretched arms. A coldness that I had never felt before overtook me. That potion, it had changed us. It may have killed my body, but my mind was intact. Logic dictates that while her body survived, her mind may have not. can only assume that the pressure that had been growing and shrank away in my head was her consciousness fading away. That these images from a different perspective were her memories. That she may be gone. After many silent hours, I rose, unaware of when I had eventually lain down on the ground. The startling sensation of tears had since become normal. The only reason I even bothered to get up, rather than let nature claim me, was that this was not my body. It was hers, and I couldn't bear the idea of letting anything happen to her. By the third morning, I gave up hope that our consciousness might emerge. The only thing left were memories. I gathered our things and prepared to venture out. With deep regret and uncertainty, I crossed the threshold into the afternoon sun and vowed to complete the adventure she had spoken of. I write this now as a record of our events and lives, with the hope that I will fulfill your goals. For you, my darling Tremella, with all our heart. I don't know about you, dear guests, but I am never able to keep a dry eye while reading this one. The beautiful love that they developed being so harshly destroyed, the loss of Ular's dear Meredith, their Tremella. This has quickly become a favorite story of mine, as well as our own apprentice. In appreciation, a skillfully crafted representation of these two souls has been created for your viewing pleasure. Please take your time to review this fine work and maybe even peruse our latest exhibit featuring several new fungi specimens. I will remain here to answer your questions. We thank you for attending Stitches and Stories with the Baker Estate Library and Archives. Have a pleasant evening.